Imogen returns to her family station, leaving the noise of the city behind for the scent of eucalyptus and the warmth of tea. Amidst the rhythmic hum of the shearing shed and the steady flow of wool, she finds a grounding peace in the company of friends. Listen as Imogen surrenders to the slow pace of the land and the restorative stillness of the countryside. The pale blue horizon. The car door slammed with a metal-sharp crack that felt like a transgression against the stillness. The sound ripped through the afternoon, startling a parliament of galas from the gray-green canopy of the gums. They erupted into the pale blue sky in a chaotic flurry of rose pink and ash. Imogen stood by the driver's side, the dust of the driveway settling on her black leather loafers, the silence that rushed back and feeling heavy, almost physical. She rubbed her palms together, the friction of skin on skin. A small, desperate attempt to ground herself, but her shoulders remained hiked toward her ears. It was a phantom weight, the residual tension of 1,000 deadlines and the humming anxiety of a city that never stopped demanding more of her than she had to give. She stayed there for a long minute, her chest tight. The air was thinner here, tasting of salt and dry earth, a stark contrast to the metal-sharp recycled breath of the office tower she had left behind. Every nerve in her body felt frayed, vibrating at a frequency that didn't match the slow, undulating rhythm of the hinterlands. She looked down at her clothes, the tailored blazer, the crisp white shirt, and felt like an intruder in a landscape that didn't recognize the currency of urgency. The stillness didn't feel like peace yet. It felt like a void she didn't know how to fill. From the shaded depths of the veranda, Desta emerged. She didn't walk so much as glide, her movements melodic and unhurried, as if she were moving through water rather than air. In her hands, she carried a wide wooden tray with 2 steaming ceramic mugs of herbal tea, the vapor curling upward in lazy ribbons. Desta stopped a few paces away, her gaze steady and soft. She didn't rush to embrace Imogen or shower her with questions. Instead, she simply stood there, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of her eyes, her presence acting as a quiet anchor in the shimmering heat. "You brought the city back with you in your marrow, Imogen," Desta said. Her voice was a rolling cadence, warm and melodic, a sound that seemed to physically push against the internal noise cluttering Imogen's mind. It wasn't a critique, but an observation of fact, delivered with the same neutrality one might use to describe the weather. Imogen reached for the mug, her fingers trembling slightly. As she took the first sip, the heat of the tea, infused with lemon myrtle and something earthy and deep, bloomed in her throat and spread downward, a slow wave of warmth that finally reached her chest. She felt a sudden, violent release in her diaphragm, forcing a deep, conscious exhale that sounded almost like a sob. The tension in her shoulders didn't vanish, but it shifted, moving from a sharp, jagged edge to a dull ache. They turned together toward the house, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. As they walked, the sharp, medicinal scent of eucalyptus hit Imogen in waves, clashing harshly with the lingering smell of city exhaust and expensive perfume clinging to her clothes. It was a sensory collision, the sterile, synthetic aroma of the metropolis fighting against the raw, honest scent of the bush. Imogen felt the incongruity of her own existence in that moment, a polished stone dropped into a wild creek. The drive was... It was a nightmare, really, Imogen began, the words spilling out in a rush. She spoke quickly, her voice thin and breathless, as if she were trying to outrun the silence. The traffic leaving Perth was stalled for miles, and then there was this detour near the coast, and I think I might have missed a turn near the crossing, and my phone lost signal about 40 kilometers back, which is just typical, isn't it? I felt like I was losing time the whole way here, like I was fighting the road just to get to the gate. Desta didn't interrupt. She didn't offer a sympathetic nod or a clarifying question. She simply folded her hands neatly in her lap as they reached the porch and stopped. She stood in absolute stillness, listening to Imogen's frantic monologue with a patient, quiet intensity. The silence that followed, Imogen's outburst was not empty. It was heavy and expectant. In that gap, Imogen's own haste felt absurd, a frantic dance performed for an audience of one who wasn't impressed by the tempo. Imogen stopped mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open, the sudden lack of noise making her feel exposed and foolish. "The road is exactly as long as it needs to be," Desta said softly, her voice like a smoothed river stone. "The only thing rushing here is you, and the wind, and neither of them is in a hurry to get anywhere important." Imogen followed Desta inside, the cool shadows of the hallway smelling of beeswax and old cedar. Her old bedroom was exactly as she had left it, a sanctuary of faded linens and books with yellowed pages. On the bedside table, resting atop a lace doily, was a small handwritten note. The ink was slightly blurred, the handwriting a familiar, sprawling scrawl. It was from her father. Welcome home, Imogen. The air is turning. The shearing season has begun early this year. Rest while you can. E. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. She didn't unpack. She simply sat, staring at the dust motes dancing in a shaft of afternoon light. As a breeze drifted through the open window, it carried a scent that bypassed her intellect and struck a chord deep in her memory, the thick, heavy smell of warm lanolin. It was the scent of sheep, of grease and earth and animal warmth. Suddenly, she was 6 years old again, tucked into the crook of a woolly flank in the shearing shed, the rhythmic snip-snip of the blades creating a heartbeat for the room. She remembered the feeling of safety, the sense that the world was a predictable, tactile place where everything had a purpose and a season. The memory was so vivid, it felt like a physical touch, a ghost of a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in a way the city never had. For a moment, the noise in her head fell silent, replaced by the phantom hum of the shed. Imogen rose and walked to the window. In the far distance, the silhouette of the shearing shed stood against the horizon, a corrugated iron monument to repetition and patience. It looked small from here, but she knew the gravity it held. She watched the way the light hit the rusted roof, turning it a deep, burnt orange. She thought of the sheep, the wool, and the slow, methodical art of the shear. She wondered if the woman who had left this place years ago still existed inside her, or if she had been overwritten by the frantic scripts of her professional life. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the windowpane, closing her eyes. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the distant rhythmic call of a crow. She realized with a sudden sharp pang of uncertainty that she no longer knew how to be still. She had forgotten how to exist without a goal, without a deadline, without a metric of success. The prospect of the shearing season, the slow, repetitive, meditative labor, felt less like a homecoming and more like a challenge she wasn't sure she could meet. As she turned to leave the room, Desta appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable but kind. She leaned against the frame, her presence a gentle reminder of the pace of the house. "Siddharth is already in the shed," Desta said. "He asked if you still remember how to hold the fleece." The hum of the shed. The air inside the shearing shed didn't just carry a scent, it carried a weight. Imogen stepped across the threshold mid-stride and was immediately hit by a low-frequency vibration that rattled her teeth and settled deep in her marrow. It was a mechanical drone, a guttural thrum from the overhead shafts and the handpieces, turning the corrugated iron structure into a giant tuning fork. The sound didn't enter through her ears so much as it pushed against her skin, a physical pressure that threatened to crowd out the frantic, fragmented thoughts she had carried from the city. Standing near the sorting table was a woman Imogen didn't recognize. She was dressed in crisp, utilitarian gear that looked too new for the dust of the station, her posture as rigid as a plumb line. She was tapping a finger rapidly on her thigh, a staccato rhythm that clashed violently with the steady hum of the shed. Every few seconds her wrist flicked upward, her eyes darting to a silver watch with a precision that felt surgical. "The bottleneck is right here," the woman said, her voice cutting through the drone with a sharp, articulate clarity. She didn't look at Imogen, but rather at the flow of the sheep. "If we shift the sorting bins 3 meters to the left and implement a staggered entry, we could shave 3 minutes of inefficiency per sheep. Over a full flock, that's hours of wasted daylight. We are treating a production line like a Sunday picnic." Imogen felt a familiar tightness coil in her shoulders. The woman's voice sounded like the boardroom meeting she had fled, the language of optimization, the cult of the metric. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt clumsy, stalled by the sheer density of the atmosphere. Beside her, Desta appeared, moving with a slow, liquid grace that seemed to ignore the frantic energy the other woman radiated. Desta didn't look at the watch or the bins. She studied the sheep, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "The wool grows at the speed of the earth, not the clock," Desta said. Her voice was a melodic roll, a soft contrast to the mechanical roar. The woman stopped tapping her thigh. She turned to Desta, her brow furrowed in genuine perplexity. "I don't follow. The biological growth rate of the fleece is irrelevant to the logistics of the harvest. We are discussing throughput, not botany." Desta offered a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach a laugh. "You are discussing how to move a thing from one place to another. We are discussing how to be with the animal while it happens. If you rush the spirit, the body resists." Imogen wanted to prove she was on the side of the spirit, but her body was still operating on city time. Seeing AU struggling at the edge of the race, Imogen stepped forward to help. She reached for the animal, her movements jerky and hurried, her mind already 3 steps ahead to the next task. She tried to nudge the sheep forward with a sharp, decisive motion, the kind of efficiency she had spent a decade perfecting in an office. The sheep didn't appreciate the efficiency. With a sudden, violent heave, the animal pivoted, its heavy flanks slamming into Imogen's hip. The impact sent her reeling sideways, and she stumbled back, her boots sliding in a patch of grease and lanolin. She crashed into a stacked wool bale, the coarse fibers scratching her arms as she sank into the wool. The sudden movement startled the rest of the line. The sheep became agitated, a ripple of bleeding and shifting hooves disrupting the rhythmic flow of the shed. The harmony was broken, replaced by a chaotic scramble of wool and noise. Imogen stayed there for a moment, pinned against the bale, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She felt the heat rising in her neck, a stinging sense of failure. She had come here to find peace, yet she had brought the very friction she was trying to escape. She was a gear that didn't fit the machine, grinding against the grain of the place. Then a hand settled on her shoulder. The pressure was firm and grounding, a heavy anchor that stopped her from spinning. Desta had leaned in, her presence a cooling shadow. She didn't ask if Imogen was all right. She simply held the contact, forcing Imogen to feel the physical reality of the moment. "Listen," Desta whispered, her voice barely audible over the drone. "Stop fighting the noise. Match the hum." Imogen closed her eyes. She stopped trying to calculate her mistake or plan her apology. She focused instead on the vibration beneath her boots, the way the concrete floor shivered in time with the machinery. She felt the thrum move up through her ankles, into her calves, settling in her chest. It was a deep, primal resonance. She began to synchronize her breathing with the mechanical pulse, letting the mental noise, the deadlines, the emails, the ghosts of her career, be drowned out by the monolithic sound of the shed. The vibration became a blanket, wrapping around her, smoothing the jagged edges of her anxiety. While Imogen drifted in the hum, the sound of a sharp exhale broke the silence. Fatima, for that was the name Imogen now recalled from the introductions, was not content to wait. "This is exactly why we need a system," Fatima declared, stepping forward. "The lack of structure leads to accidents. If we implement a fast-track sorting system, we can eliminate these variables." Fatima began to direct the sheep with crisp, commanding gestures, her voice a series of sharp directives. She pushed the animals with a clinical precision, ignoring the subtle shifts in their weight and the flicker of their ears. For a few minutes, it looked as though she had regained control, but the sheep were not machines. They grew stiff. They stopped mid-stride, refusing to move into the new, efficient channels Fatima had created. The line ground to a halt. The fast tracks had become a wall of stubborn wool. Fatima stood frozen, her finger hovering over her watch, her expression one of sheer bafflement. She had applied the perfect logic to a system that didn't recognize logic. Siddharth finally stepped into the center of the fray, his presence a low-frequency resonance that matched the machinery. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the lead sheep and placed a hand on its flank, a slow, rhythmic pat that seemed to communicate 1,000 unspoken reassurances. The animal relaxed instantly, its muscles softening under his touch. As the first fleece of the afternoon was shorn and dropped onto the floor, Imogen leaned forward, her gaze zooming in on the wool. She watched as the massive, cream-colored coil settled. It didn't just fall, it unfurled in a slow, spiraling motion, the fibers interlocking in a complex fractal geometry. She noticed a rhythmic pattern in the way the wool settled, a pulsing expansion and contraction that mirrored the hum of the floor. It was a visual heartbeat, a slow-motion bloom of lanolin light. For the first time since she had stepped off the plane, the tightness in her chest loosened. The shed wasn't just a place of work, it was a living thing, and she was finally starting to hear it breathe. The unfolding cloud. Siddharth didn't fight the sheep, he leaned into it. He moved in a series of low, sweeping arcs, his weight shifting from one foot to the other with the fluid precision of a dancer who had memorized the floorboards. The handpiece of the shears didn't chatter or jerk, it hummed a single, sustained note, gliding through the wool like a brush across a wet canvas. Imogen stood a few feet away, her shoulders finally dropping an inch from her ears. She watched the way his forearms flexed, the skin taut over muscle, moving in a rhythmic synchronicity with the animal's own rise and fall. There was no aggression in the movement, only a profound, resonant patience that seemed to slow the very air in the shed. Then came the moment of release. With one final sweeping motion, the fleece detached. It didn't simply fall, it unfurled. The massive cream-colored coil cascaded downward in a slow-motion bloom, hitting the concrete floor like a heavy, grounded cloud. The wool spiraled outward, a fractal geometry of lanolin and warmth, settling into a soft, concentric circle that looked more like a sculpture than a byproduct of labor. Imogen felt a strange, dizzying pull in her chest, as if the sight of the wool unfolding was unlocking something inside her that had been clamped shut for years. She found herself stepping closer, her gaze locked on the way the light caught the greasy sheen of the fibers. "The trick isn't in the hand," Siddharth said, his voice a low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel through the floor and into the soles of Imogen's boots. He didn't look up from the sheep, his focus remaining steady. "The shearer has to stop being a person and start being a part of the sheep's own breathing. If you fight the rhythm, the sheep fights you. If you become the rhythm, you're just helping the animal shed a weight it no longer needs. You have to listen with your skin, not your ears." Beside her, Fatima had gone still. Her hand, which had spent the last hour hovering near the face of her wristwatch, finally dropped to her side. She wasn't calculating throughput or timing the intervals anymore. She was staring at the pile of wool on the floor, her brow furrowed not in judgment, but in a budding, quiet curiosity. The clinical precision she had tried to impose on the shed had failed, but the seamless transition she had just witnessed, the effortless glide of the blade, and the gentle surrender of the animal, seemed to defy the logic she relied upon. For the first time, the silence between the mechanical hums didn't seem like wasted time to her. It seemed like a space for something else to happen. Imogen closed her eyes for a second, trying to capture the cadence of Siddharth's movement. She began to mirror his breathing, drawing air deep into the bottom of her lungs, holding it for a heartbeat, and letting it out in a slow, conscious exhale. As she did, a strange lightness washed over her, a floating sensation that made the edges of the shed blur. The frantic, jagged noise of her city life, the ghost pings of emails, the relentless pressure of deadlines, the artificial glare of office lights, felt suddenly distant, like a radio station fading out as she drove further into the scrub. Her head felt airy, her thoughts slowing down until they matched the steady, monolithic pulse of the machinery. The peace was punctured by a sudden guttural bleat. A large ram, a stubborn beast with curling horns and a gaze like weathered stone, had decided he had had enough. He planted his hooves, his muscles bunching under a thick, matted coat, and let out a sharp, defiant sound that echoed off the corrugated iron walls. He didn't move toward the stand, he simply locked his joints and refused to budge, a living wall of wool and stubbornness. The rhythmic flow of the shed stuttered. The other sheep sensed the tension, their ears flicking, their movements becoming erratic. Fatima stepped forward instinctively, her voice regaining its sharp, commanding edge. "He's blocking the line. If we don't move him now, the rest of the group will bottleneck." "Let me push him through," she said, her hand already reaching out to apply a firm, corrective pressure to the ram's shoulder. Her movement was efficient, designed to achieve a result in the shortest amount of time, but it was an intrusion. Siddharth moved with a sudden, quiet speed, stepping between Fatima and the ram. He didn't push her away, but his presence acted as a soft barrier. He didn't speak a word of warning. Instead, he turned to the ram and gave a slow, rhythmic nod, his eyes locking onto the animal's. He reached out and placed a palm flat against the ram's flank, not gripping or shoving, but applying a steady, pulsing pat. It was a conversation in touch, a reassurance that the world was still safe, that the rhythm had not been broken. For several long seconds, the man and the beast stood in a stalemate of silence. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the ram's tension evaporated. He let out a long sigh, his muscles softening, and he stepped forward into the shearing stand of his own volition. Imogen watched the interaction with a tightening in her throat. She looked down at the raw wool on the floor and reached out, sinking her fingers into the fleece. The texture was an immediate, visceral shock, heavy, oily, and profoundly warm. The scent of lanolin rose up to meet her, a thick, earthy aroma that smelled of rain, dust, and ancient things. It was a sensory anchor, pinning her to the present moment with an intensity that made her eyes sting. The tactile richness of the wool felt like a physical manifestation of the belonging she had been searching for, a tangible link to a history she had almost forgotten. An ache blossomed in her chest as she compared this singular focused task to the fragmented chaos of her previous life. In the city, she had been 1,000 different versions of herself, sliced thin by a dozen different obligations, always rushing toward a horizon that never actually arrived. Here, there was only the wool, the breath, and the hum of the shed. The simplicity of it was almost unbearable. She felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over this stillness, a desire to shield it from the world of clocks and spreadsheets that Fatima had brought with her. Siddharth finished the next sheep and stepped back, wiping a smudge of grease from his forearm with a rag. He studied Imogen, his gaze steady and knowing, as if he could see the exact shape of the tension she was trying to shed. He leaned against the wooden pillar of the shed, the mechanical hum providing a backdrop to the sudden quiet between them. "You have your father's eyes for the wool," Siddharth said, his low register resonant in the enclosed space. "But you don't have his hands yet. He used to do something with the tension of the handpiece that no one else could quite replicate, a way of easing the blade into the skin that felt more like a massage than a cut." Imogen blinked, her fingers still buried in the cream-colored fleece. "I didn't know he had a technique. He never talked about the technical side of it." Siddharth gave a slow, rhythmic nod, a small, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. He looked toward the back of the shed, where the old equipment was stored under heavy canvas tarps, relics of a different era of the station. "Your father didn't just follow the rhythm, Imogen. He knew how to change it," Siddharth whispered. "He left something behind in the old lockers, something he told me only to show you when you finally stopped rushing." The heavy noon. The veranda shade was a thick indigo sanctuary, a sharp contrast to the white hot glare of the Western Australian noon that turned the horizon into a shimmering, liquid haze. Imogen sank into a heavy jarrah chair, the wood still holding a ghost of the morning's heat, and let out a long, shuddering exhale. Her muscles felt fluid, as if the rhythmic vibration of the shearing shed had shaken the city's rigid architecture out of her bones. Beside her, the world seemed to slow to a crawl. The air was heavy with the scent of crushed eucalyptus and the sharp tang of the distant machinery, creating a stillness so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her skin. Callum sat on the edge of the porch, his boots caked in a pale, chalky dust. He wasn't speaking, but a soft, wordless melody drifted from his throat, a low, humming vibration that didn't compete with the environment but instead wove itself into the distant, rhythmic drone of a tractor working a far paddock. It was a sound of total integration. Imogen watched him, noting how his gaze remained fixed on a single, iridescent beetle navigating the grain of the floorboards, his presence as unobtrusive as the shadow of the eaves. Siddharth handed her a tin cup, the metal beaded with condensation. Imogen took it with both hands, the sudden, piercing cold of the surface sending a jolt through her palms. When she drank, the water was ice-cold and tasted faintly of iron and deep earth. The liquid shocked her system, a vivid, freezing current that chased the lingering heat from her throat and snapped her consciousness into a sharp, crystalline focus. She felt the water settle in her stomach, a cool anchor in the shimmering heat, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to check a screen or cross-reference a schedule. She simply existed in the space between the swallow and the breath. Across the table, Fatima performed a gesture that felt almost liturgical in its deliberation. She reached for her wrist, unbuckling the leather strap of her watch with a slow, clicking precision. She didn't put it in her pocket or slide it into her bag. She placed it face down on the weathered timber of the table, the glass lens hidden from view. It was a silent surrender, a conscious decision to abandon the tyranny of the minute hand in favor of the station's slower, more ancient clock. Her expression remained crisp, but the habitual tension in her jaw had softened, replaced by a look of quiet, exhausted curiosity. Siddharth leaned back against the veranda pillar, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a man who had just finished a long prayer. There was a profound spiritual satisfaction etched into the lines around his eyes, the look of a person who had not just worked a flock, but had entered a state of total harmony with them. He had moved through the shed not as an operator of machinery, but as a part of the rhythm itself, and the residue of that peace clung to him like the scent of lanolin. "The shears are fighting you, Fatima," Callum said softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the afternoon. He wasn't looking at her, but rather at the set of tools laid out on a cloth between them. "You're applying the oil like you're scrubbing a floor. You're forcing the lubricant into the joint rather than letting it find the gap." Fatima stiffened slightly, her finger tapping once against her thigh, a ghost of her old habit. "The manual specifies a thorough coating to prevent friction at high speeds. If the lubrication is insufficient, the heat buildup degrades the blade's edge." Callum didn't argue. He didn't even look up. He simply reached out and took the oil can, his movements fluid and devoid of urgency. He applied a single, microscopic drop to the pivot point and then, with a touch as light as a breath, used a soft cloth to guide the oil inward with a gentle, circular motion. He didn't push, he coaxed. He slid the tool back toward her, the metal now gleaming with a muted, natural luster rather than a greasy sheen. "It's not about the volume of the oil," Callum whispered, finally meeting her eyes with a fleeting, humble glance. "It's about the invitation. If you invite the oil in, the metal stays cool. If you force it, you're just fighting the tool." Fatima looked at the shears, then at her face-down watch, and then back at the tools. She didn't respond with a correction or a statistic. Instead, she reached out and mimicked Callum's circular motion, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to shed the velocity of her own nature. The silence that followed wasn't a void to be filled, but a shared space of understanding. For a long stretch of time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant call of a crow and the rhythmic creak of the house settling in the heat. Imogen felt a strange, heavy warmth settling into her shoulders. Not the tension of a deadline, but the honest weight of physical labor and the luxury of an unplanned hour. "Is this what it means to actually be here, Trobjerd?" she wondered, the thought spiraling inward. Not just standing on the soil, but inhabiting the silence without trying to solve it. In the city, silence was always a gap, a failure of communication, or a precursor to a crisis. I spent a decade treating my own mind like a browser with too many tabs open, always waiting for the page to load, always anticipating the next notification. But here, the silence is the substance. It's the wool, the water, the humming. I can feel the edges of my anxiety blurring, dissolving into the heat haze. I am becoming a singular thing again, instead of a fragmented collection of roles. She realized she was rubbing her palms together, a slow, grounding friction that mirrored the movement of the shearing blades. The sensation of her own skin, the warmth of her hands, the smell of the dust, it all felt amplified, as if the volume of the world had been turned up. She studied Siddharth, and he gave her a slow, rhythmic nod, as if acknowledging the internal shift she had just experienced. He knew the weight of the silence, and he knew how long it took for a city heart to stop racing. Callum shifted his position, leaning back against the railing. "My grandfather used to say that the land has a heartbeat, but it's too slow for most people to hear," he said, his voice a hushed, melodic murmur. He spent 40 years in the same 3 paddocks. He told me that if you do the same task 1,000 times, oil the shears, move the fence, check the water, you eventually stop doing the task and start becoming part of the repetition. The work disappears, and all that's left is the peace of the motion. I think that's why I like the humming. It matches the pulse of the dirt. Imogen closed her eyes, letting Callum's words drift over her like a warm breeze. She felt a kinship with this quiet boy, a shared recognition of the sanctuary found in the mundane. The world felt balanced, the air thick and golden, the group bound together by a fragile, unspoken serenity that felt more precious than any professional achievement she had ever chased. Then, the vibration reached her before the sound did. It was a low, guttural thrum that traveled through the soles of her feet, breaking the stillness of the veranda. A few seconds later, the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a vehicle. It wasn't the familiar rattle of the station's old utility truck, but the heavy, confident roll of a luxury engine. As the car rounded the bend of the driveway, kicking up a plume of white dust that obscured the shimmering horizon, the peace of the noon vanished. The group sat frozen, the shared silence suddenly replaced by a sharp, cold tension as a stranger stepped out into the blinding light. The golden descent. The dust from the stranger's car still hung in the air, a suspended veil of grit that tasted of metal tang and old roads. But Imogen didn't move toward the vehicle. She stayed anchored to the veranda, her boots feeling as though they had grown roots into the weathered timber. The stranger stood by the door of the sleek obsidian-black sedan, a sharp silhouette against a horizon that had begun to bruise into deep shades of violet and gold. The silence that followed the engine's cut was different from the silence of the shearing shed. It wasn't a meditative void, but a taut wire, vibrating with a sudden, unwelcome frequency. Imogen watched the way the light caught the edges of the eucalyptus trees, casting long, skeletal shadows that stretched across the yard like fingers reaching for the house. The tension in the air was thick, but as she exhaled, she felt a strange, detached distance from the intruder. The noise of the city, the sirens, the relentless clicking of keyboards, the frantic internal tally of deadlines felt like a radio station she had finally tuned out. The stranger began to speak, but the words were swallowed by the wind, leaving only the visual of a man in a tailored suit who looked entirely wrong against the backdrop of red dirt and lanolin. She didn't engage. Instead, she stepped off the veranda, her legs feeling heavy and warm, a physical weight that felt honest. She walked away from the confrontation, moving toward the house with a slow, deliberate pace. Each step was a conscious choice to remain in the rhythm she had discovered with Siddharth. The gravel shifted beneath her soles, a rhythmic crunch that acted as a metronome, keeping her heart steady even as she felt the gaze of the stranger on her back. She wasn't fleeing, she was simply refusing to accelerate. Desta was waiting by the kitchen door, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression a map of quiet observation. She didn't ask about the car or the man. She simply looked at Imogen, her eyes tracing the line of her neck and the slope of her collarbones. Desta gave a single, slow nod of approval. It was a silent confirmation. Imogen's shoulders had finally dropped. The armor she had worn for a decade in the city, the invisible bracing against a world that always demanded more, had finally cracked and fallen away, leaving her soft and open to the evening. "The kettle is already singing," Desta said, her voice a rolling melodic current that pulled Imogen into the warmth of the kitchen. Inside, the air was a thick tapestry of smells. The scent of dried lemon myrtle and chamomile mingled with the cooling night air that drifted through the open window. Imogen moved beside Desta, her movements mirroring the older woman's economy of motion. There was no rush to prepare the brew. They moved in a shared choreography, passing the ceramic teapot and the honey jar without needing to speak. Imogen felt the heat of the steam against her cheeks, a damp warmth that seemed to dissolve the last remnants of the day's friction. "You have the smell of the flock on you," Desta remarked, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of her mouth. "It is the best perfume a woman can wear in this house. It means you have stopped fighting the land and started listening to it." Imogen leaned against the heavy oak table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. A profound, sleepy surrender began to wash over her, starting at the crown of her head and sinking down through her chest. It wasn't the hollow exhaustion of a 12-hour workday in an office, that kind of tiredness that leaves the mind racing while the body dies. This was a heavy, rewarding fatigue, a physical debt paid in full for a day of honest repetition. Her muscles felt like warm wax, malleable and quiet. She retreated to her bedroom as the golden hour reached its peak, the light filtering through the leaves of the surrounding gums to create a shifting kaleidoscope of amber and charcoal on the ceiling. The room smelled of old cedar and dried lavender. As she shed her work clothes, the tactile sensation of the soft linen sheets against her skin felt almost electric. The fabric was cool and crisp, a sharp contrast to the lingering warmth of her body. She slid into the bed, the weight of the quilt pressing her down into the mattress, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. She lay there for a long time, watching the patterns of light dance across the ceiling in slow, rhythmic arcs. She considered the slowness she had feared when she first arrived, the terrifying prospect of a life without a schedule, without a metric for success. She realized now that the city's version of speed was an illusion, a frantic treadmill that led nowhere. The true movement was here, in the slow unfurling of a fleece, the patient steeping of tea, and the deliberate descent of the sun. To move slowly was not to stagnate. It was the only way to actually arrive. She lifted her arm, smelling the faint, musk-like scent of lanolin that still clung to her skin despite the wash. It was a comforting, primal smell, the scent of protection, of ancestral endurance. It felt like a brand of belonging, a physical marker that she was no longer a visitor in her own history. She was part of the station, a single thread in a weave that stretched back generations. As she closed her eyes, the world narrowed. The sounds of the house, the settling of the timber, the distant call of a night bird became a soft blur. Her breathing slowed, matching the pulse of the dirt that Callum had spoken of. She felt herself slipping, the edges of her consciousness blurring into the dark, gold-fringed velvet of a deep, dreamless slumber. The tension of the stranger's arrival felt like a dream from someone else's life, a distant echo that couldn't reach her in this sanctuary. Just as the heaviness became absolute, the floorboards in the hallway groaned under a heavy, unfamiliar step. There was a silence, then a sharp, rhythmic knock on her bedroom door. 3 hits, precise and demanding. Imogen opened her eyes, the piece fracturing. The door creaked open just an inch, and the stranger's voice, cold and devoid of the land's warmth, sliced through the silence. "I believe you have something in the lockers that belongs to my family," he said.